Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other topics, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Welcome to Ballot Battleground Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Margiott, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. The first month of the Nevada legislative session is almost behind us, and after a few weeks of mostly presentations and budget hearings, it is now in full swing with significant bill hearings happening daily. It is a flurry of activity now with less than 100 days left in the session. This episode, I figured it'd be a great time to check in on what's happened so far and how the big debates of the 83rd session are shaping up. If you don't know how the Nevada legislature works, pause this episode, go back to our last show, and check it out. It's a quick civics lesson, NV Leg 101, with a longtime Nevada lobbyist. But this week, we're diving right in with two of the best legislative reporters who are in the building getting the pulse almost every single day. This episode, I'm joined by friend of the pod, Tabitha Mueller of the Nevada Independent, and longtime friend but first-time guest, Paul Boger with Nevada Public Radio. Together, the three of us get you up to speed on the 83rd session. Once again, we're back inside the building, joined by two of probably the most informed legislative reporters that I've had the pleasure of working with. Paul Boger, Nevada Public Radio, Tabitha Mueller, the Nevada Independent. Thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks, bud.
Thanks for having us on.
How are we holding up? What are we on, day 24 of the session now? How are we doing?
I don't even know anymore.
Vibe check.
Time has lost all meaning. And,
already in the first month.
Listen, we were already struggling after the pandemic for time to make sense, and now we're back in the legislative session yet again. This building's a time suck.
We are on legislative time, as always.
And legislative time isn't real time. Just doesn't exist.
No, it doesn't exist.
Meetings don't happen when they're scheduled to happen.
No.
Things get pulled from agendas. Everything is fluid.
Yeah. Before we dive into the meat of this, Paul, what are you focusing on this session? What would you say are kind of your main topics that you're looking into?
When I think about the legislative session, the big things that come to mind are the budget, of course. That's the one thing that lawmakers have to pass every year. It's the only thing they really have to do. So thinking about the budget, and then thinking about one of my things I like to focus on is education, in particular, education policy. Outside of Medicaid, that is where the state spends by far the most money. And of course, it's for public education. It's to make sure that kids can graduate and, get a career or go to college. And so it's a major investment. And one of the things that Nevada has consistently struggled on is getting a good return on that investment. So that's one of the things I always like to focus on in the session.
Tabitha, same question for you. And by the way, a happy belated birthday, right?
Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.
29.
29.
There we go. And the Capitol Bureau Chief now officially in a new role. So you're kind of running the whole Indy team up here. Golf clap from Paul here. What are you focused on this session?
So along with Paul, we're really looking at the budget. Can we afford to pay for the services that people need? We're also paying attention to what's happening at the federal level and how that could affect Nevada. About a third of our state budget relies on that federal funding. We could see a lot of changes depending on whether that amount of money shifts, right? And we don't know much. It's very speculative right now. The other thing, as a reporter, I really focus on healthcare, health policy. We're seeing a lot of folks talking about healthcare access and lowering costs for Nevadans in that realm. So that's something we're following. And then our team is also paying attention to things like film tax credits and we'll immigration policy and a number of other issues that are coming before legislators this session.
All right, we're talking in week 4 here. I feel like really the first week, 2 weeks, even stretched in the third week, you have a lot of on that first day, especially the pomp and circumstance. Even in the first week, we're doing presentations, we're learning about state agencies and budgets. Is it fair to say that you guys would agree, and you guys are in the building, I think, like every day, so more than me. Are we into the meat of this session? Are we into the thick of it now? Because we are starting to see some of those big bill hearings coming up.
Absolutely. And I know Paul's nodding right now. I think for me, at least, I think we actually started a lot faster this year because of the budget kerfuffle at the beginning, right? The governor's budget had a pretty sizable deficit in it that they managed to kind of rectify. It looks like there's a lot of one-shot funding in that. We'll talk about it later, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But I think ever since then, bills are coming faster than they have in the past. We actually have data showing that we are in the thick of it.
It's also important to note that's a little bit by design. Lawmakers on the Legislative Council, which is part of that interim group that meets in between the legislative sessions, they started these budget hearings a lot earlier this session, about 2 weeks earlier than they normally do. So really, we've been in the thick of it for a couple weeks now. Now, of course, it's still slow as compared to those last few weeks, but it is moving a lot faster than usual.
Yeah. Tabitha, you guys did the deep dive on comparing Lombardo's amended budget to the initial budget that was presented that had those major structural errors that Democrats were blasting and saying this is going to throw off the whole session. What were some of the big things that you guys pulled out of that in terms of what was fixed or had to be cut to kind of make up for that?
So nothing was really cut from the budget. What we actually saw is that a lot of the proposals that were in there were shifted to one-time allocations, right? There's about $520 million in one-shots. And aside from the COVID sessions where we had so much money pouring in to address the pandemic, we've never seen that kind of a size before. It was definitely unprecedented, that $520 million. And the reason why we care about that is because when you think about it, in 2 years from now, Nevadans are going to have to come back and approve a new budget. If we are used to receiving the services like extended pre-K, which is one of them that was under their charter school transportation, though there might not be money for that, especially because Governor Joe Lombardo has really emphasized that he is not having any new taxes. And so there's questions about how do we continue to pay for this in the future? Is it realistic to do so?
Paul, anything to add on that?
Well, one of the ways that they also fixed it is by looking at the reversions. You know, there are cost savings at the end of the year. One of the things that the Lombardo administration did is that, you know, over time, over the last several bienniums, they've noticed that the state is saving a lot more money at the end of each year. And that savings comes from open state employee positions. We know that there's about a 13% vacancy rate in state employees across the state. So they started baking that into the formula, making sure that those savings are accounted for. So that also was a big fix in their budget things, in their budget errors. But like Tabitha said, there's a lot of one-shot money in here. The other thing is that lawmakers in general, I think across the state, not just here at the legislature, but in the counties and in city governments, are also having issues with their budgets because of that lack of COVID funding. They got really, they started banking on that money being there, and now that it's gone, they're struggling to figure out what to do.
And I'll just add real quick. We covered the Sparks State of the City address just this week for an example, and Sparks Mayor Ed Lawson projecting a $12 million budget deficit, a sizable deficit for a city, you know, so the size of Sparks, and it's going to be presumably similar deficits in Washington County, Reno, other local governments as a result.
And people are used to receiving those services now, right? It's part of the norm, and they don't see that as something that was just temporary for COVID. And so that's part of the problem as well, is how do we continue to meet these needs or continue to provide the services that we have been?
We have one major bill that's already been passed, and it's rare to have this, you know, so early in the session. We're talking about eggs. How are you guys dealing with the high prices of eggs right now? Paul, you a big egg consumer?
Yes, a big egg consumer. We eat a lot of eggs in our house. We try to eat less meat, and you know, one way we do that is by making up for it with eggs, lots of breakfast for dinners, that sort of thing. Yeah, and it's gotten harder to buy eggs. It's a lot more expensive, that's for sure. But you know, looking at the legislation, egg prices are high everywhere, not because of Nevada started all of a sudden having cage-free eggs.
Sure.
Instead, that's caused by the avian flu, and there's not really a lot that anybody can do about that right now.
Yeah, and I'll give the introduction for people who might be hearing about this for the first time. Assemblyman Howard Watts came forward with a bill. It's already been passed and signed into law. It allows the state quarantine officer to suspend Nevada's cage-free egg requirement for up to 120 days in response to things like we're seeing right now where the avian flu has really cut the egg supply pretty drastically. You guys did the story, Tabitha, in the Indy explaining, you know, how quickly? How much of an effect is this really going to have?
The answer is that we don't actually think it'll have that big of an effect. It's, to quote a phrase that lawmakers love, it's a tool in the toolbox, right?
Sure, yeah.
It gives them something to do and to help with it. Whether or not we actually see prices decrease dramatically because of it is still up for interpretation, right? We know that to get eggs into Nevada, that transportation has a cost. At least if you're living in northern Nevada in Reno, most of our foodstuffs is shipped in over the mountains, both from kind of the Utah area and the California area. That adds costs and expenses as well. I'm really lucky in that my eggs come from my mom, who has a little farm. So
Nice.
I will give a shout out to my mom. Her eggs are excellent. But I think when you're really looking at sort of this issue, folks are still feeling the pinch at the grocery store.
You hopefully don't have to pay at all, right? Because you get the special deal.
I get a
from
special
Mom.
deal on
Sweet.
these eggs, let me tell you.
This episode is brought to you by Abercrombie. There's nothing better than the perfect jean and going out top combo, or an outfit that perfectly matches your plans. Abercrombie's relaxed jean goes with every occasion. Date nights with something lace, or daytime with a cozy sweater. And their barrel jean will surprise you. It's the trend that will become a staple in your wardrobe. Abercrombie denim comes in tons of rises, fits, and washes. Find your perfect pair online or in store.
What made that bill interesting to me, too, was, it was Assemblyman Watts, who I think it was back in 2021, that sponsored the bill originally, that created this cage-free egg requirement in the first place. And he and legislative Democrats and leadership and all Republicans then voted to undo this, or at least temporarily. Do you guys think that will, I've already seen a little bit of chatter where it's like Democrats created this problem by passing this egg-free requirement in the first place, and now they're trying to take credit for this minor, undoing of this requirement that may or may not help a little bit in the meantime.
You want to pontificate on this one?
Oh, I think that you're going to see anything in this legislative session used as kind of a political bowling ball, right? We're going to see any issue, like it's Governor Joe Lombardo is up for re-election in 2026, right? You're going to see attacks. I personally don't see it that way as like where I sit. I think that, they tried to solve an issue with this. They're coming back and saying, let's make a change here, a temporary. Again, we said that this may not have as big of an effect, but we are going to see these types of things in the news because that's what politicians do, right? And it's like with anything, right? The budget cuts, we saw Democrats attacking the governor over this for a long time. That's politics.
Listen, this was an easy win for everybody involved.
Sure.
That's why no one voted against it, right?
Right,
I believe this passed unanimously. So everybody saw this as an easy win that they can immediately go to voters and say, hey, we did something on the state level to at least try to make your life a little bit easier, try to bring prices down just a little bit. Now, we are absolutely probably going to hear something about eggs in 2026. But like Tabitha said, pretty much everything in this session is going to be geared towards posturing for next year's election. That's every assembly member is up for re-election. Half the Senate's up for re-election. The governor's up for re-election. Every other state office. It's going to be, at least on the state level, a very big election.
No doubt. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves. So let's get back on session, as much as I'd love to talk 2026 midterms with you guys, because the egg bill really is kind of the exception to the rule, which is that bill got fast-tracked. They had some waivers, right, to speed this thing through the process. Most other bills are kind of in the hearing phase, where they're just going before a committee, getting a bill hearing. Tabitha, what's maybe the most significant bill hearing that you've covered so far?
Well, this week we're going to be covering the film tax credit hearing, right? That's Assembly Member Sandra Howdeggy. Her bill is up. There's a separate bill that's in the Senate that hasn't yet been scheduled for a hearing, but I think that proposal is to expand Nevada's existing film tax credit dollars from $10 million, which is now, to $105 million. And that is transferable tax credit, so those companies could sell them to another company or do something else with them. So I think that's a big bill that we're going to be paying attention to, that we've watched. There's also been a lot of other measures, though, that have been up for a hearing that are maybe less flashy, we'll say, that we've also been paying attention to for Northern Nevada readers. The toll road question, right?
I missed that one yesterday, but
That's
whether
gonna
or
be
not
big.
we should have a toll road connecting the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, USA Parkway, Tesla, all those to Spanish Springs. It got heard in committee Tuesday, right?
I believe so. Is it today?
It was yesterday.
Was it yesterday?
I think.
Yes.
Again, time has no meaning in this building.
Paul, same question for you.
I think that, of course, as somebody who grew up in Arizona, I would really like to see us stop changing time. Of course, that is Assemblymember Selena LaRue Hatch's bill to put Nevada on standard time. Of course, that's not one of the major pieces of legislation that we've seen, but it is an interesting one. And I think that is one that also, again, connects with voters. That's what a vast majority of voters actually talk about, is why are we still changing time?
Yeah.
You know,
Anecdotally, I'll say too, we covered this on Monday. They had the hearing, blew up on social media, as you can imagine. Let me get your insight as an Arizonan, and I lived there for 4 years when I was going to Arizona State. When you moved to Nevada, I mean, how silly did you find it that we kept springing forward and falling back after being on permanent time for much of your life, right? Or permanent standard time?
You know, it just didn't make any sense to me. I actually moved to Alabama, and where we were in Alabama first was this very small town, and it would get dark at like 4 p.m. in the winter, and it was just so oppressively dark all the time. But I got used to it in the way that I guess, you know, you get used to all things that kind of just you have to deal with. But I, for one, as a voter, would like to stop and, you know, would like to end daylight savings time. And I don't know, maybe that's not what I should be doing, but
There's been a handful of bills that would have, you know, tied us to California, other Western states, or requested that the federal government, you know, do something on this issue. What's interesting and unique about this one, at least to me and Selena LaRue Hatch, the assemblywoman or assembly member from West Reno, told us, is that this doesn't require any of that. It just makes the change. And you can't make the change to permanent daylight time for people who are asking. That is not allowed by the federal government, but you can switch to permanent standard time with just one bill. And this bill actually got a hearing, unlike several that we've seen in sessions past.
what might be interesting about that is, you're right, we actually have passed some version of this bill in the past. Now, there is a bill submitted by Utah Congresswoman Malloy that would actually make it legal for states to be on daylight saving time. So we've passed that resolution saying, hey, if the federal government changes to this, let's go to that. So what's going to happen if there is a change on the federal level with all of these competing laws? That's actually the interesting question in all of this. But there's also, they're looking at other bills that are going through the legislature. One that I think could have a major impact on both Washoe and Clark County is that lawmakers would like county commissioners, city planners to really start considering ways to adapt to the changing climate, specifically how to deal with extreme heat. In Southern Nevada specifically, they had something like 400 or 500 people die this year, last year because of extreme heat. So when, city councilors and planners are adopting these new developments, developers need to show hey, there's access to water, there's access to public shade, there's access to cooling centers, places where people can actually go sit somewhere and cool down before they actually, approve of these developments.
Interesting bill, got a hearing last week, right, Paul?
Yes.
I'll take through a couple other bills that have gotten hearings that have stood out to us that we've covered on News 4 and that maybe you guys have covered as well. A bill to, crack down and regulate bounce houses after the death of Reno girl Lizzie Hammond, a tragic incident several years back. More licensing, insurance inspection, proper anchoring for those bounce houses, which can be deadly. And I think Northern Nevada learned that, unfortunately, with that incident. Yeah. And a bill to make wrong-way driving a crime again. I think I covered this week before last. It was a civil infraction that came out of, I think it was 2021, when we made so many of these traffic offenses civil instead of criminal in order to kind of reduce the overall burden on the criminal justice system. And now it seems like there's momentum, at least when it comes to wrong-way driving, to put that back in the category of criminal yet again. Thoughts on that bill? And it seemed like it got a positive reception. I don't believe there was any opposition when it was heard.
Yeah, I think it got a pretty positive reception. And I think that's in response to a lot of the accidents that have happened, right? I mean, there's been a lot of deaths in the news about it. And it's sort of responding to just how do we try and crack down on this a little bit.
And I think, it's one of those bills that kind of goes to speak to what the legislature does on a vast majority of the time, right? There are hundreds of bills before lawmakers right now, and I would say 90% of them are making small changes to government, right?
Making things around the edges.
Right, making things more efficient or making things more accessible or fixing things that were broken in previous sessions. Believe it or not, lawmakers spend a lot of time fixing technical errors that pop up just because there's always questions about the law. So these bills are going to pass. They're going to pass with probably 95% bipartisan, right? They're not big laws. So it's really, we spend our time focusing on 10 to 15% of the legislation that's actually going through this building, because that's the big legislation where lawmakers are going to spend the most time and we're going to have the bigger conversations.
And we've been speaking with a lot of different members of the Assembly, especially freshman members for our freshman orientation series that we do. And I'm thinking of Assembly Member Heather Golding and Assembly Member Linda Hunt, both Democrats. They both said that they really want to bring legislation that can positively benefit the communities that they live within, right? And so taking those bills that you're like, this is a small local problem and addressing it, right? Maybe it's a public safety concern. Maybe it's junkyard cars not getting towed. I think Assemblymember Golding has a bill to kind of address that. And I think that those are the daily life events that you as a taxpayer and you as a constituent are sort of upset about on a regular basis. And so I think that's something that I think is always fascinating. Like Paul said, it's often that stuff doesn't, because it's not flashy. It doesn't get the coverage maybe.
You found your person. Now let The Knot help you with everything else. The Knot connects you to the wedding inspo, vendors, venues, and planning tools you need to make your day totally you. Having helped plan 25 million weddings, we've got your back when it comes to every little detail like RSVPs, budgets, and more. Because your wedding comes to life with the connections that matter the most. Get started at theknot.com/audio. The Knot. Let's plan your wedding together.
Absolutely. And I'm glad we got to touch on a few of those, because now we'll talk some more of the flashier ones. Some of the bills that have been introduced but haven't yet gotten to hearings yet. And the big one always, especially for news people, TV news people especially, there's going to be 150, 200 people probably here for the gun bills when they get heard in committee, assuming that happens at some point in this session. I won't summarize all of them, but kind of the big one is raising the age to buy semi-automatic weapons from 18 to 21. Two other gun-related measures that were vetoed by the governor in 2023. Do you guys have any insight maybe on whether or not Democrats plan to send those bills to the governor a second time and put the ball in his court in 2025 ahead of an election next year?
I think you need to understand that Assemblymember Sandra Hautegui was a victim of the shooting that was in Las Vegas. Was it the Harvest?
Yeah, Route 91 Harvest Festival.
Route 91 Harvest Festival shooting that took place. She is a massive advocate of let's take a look at our gun laws. Let's kind of reform them, make them stronger. I think that Democrats have really tried to stay away from we're taking away your guns as a messaging point. It's just not popular here in Nevada, right? We have a very purple population, I would say. A lot of folks that are pro-gun access. But I think that they view these reforms as common sense reforms is how they've been framed. And they are absolutely going to come back. And they will, because both houses are controlled by Democrats, it is likely that they will end up on the governor's desk.
Right. And it really does just put the ball back in the governor's court. And the governor has, I wouldn't say a difficult path to re-election next year, but he does have to, appease his base and make his base happy. He's a moderate Republican, and he has to make sure that those more conservative Republicans who are against any sort of gun legislation that's going to come from Democrats, no matter what it is, he's got to make sure that they're appeased as well. So politically, I mean, I don't see what else he can do, but it is the governor. He has made interesting choices in the past when it comes to approving legislation, vetoing legislation. So we'll see what he does with it.
You guys just wrote in your Behind the Bar newsletter, Tabitha, about the lottery. It passed in 2023. Nevada not allowed to have a lottery right now. I think it dates back to the fact that we have obviously all these casinos. They're such a huge part of our economy. Should we have a lottery? There was a bill 2 years ago to start that process because it would take a constitutional amendment. What's the latest from Democrats on whether or not they want to advance that one more time in this session to put it on the ballot to legalize the lottery in 26?
So my colleague Howard Stutz is definitely the person to follow on this issue if you're interested in it. But I think that the chances that it survives are very slim at this point. That's just my observation.
Yeah.
When we spoke with Assembly Speaker Steve Yeager, he was sort of non-committal on the issue, right? Sort of, let's take a look at it. Let's see what it's going. Sort of the slow playing of that poker hand, right? Let's see what we have and what we know. Now, we know that Resorts Association Gaming, not a big fan of that piece of legislation. I think that there's some appetite to maybe bring some of the folks that are going over to California or another state to participate in the Powerball, that kind of lottery, to kind of get in on the funding from there. But I don't see much of an appetite this session.
It's interesting because it passed, I believe, almost unanimously in 2023, and you're sensing that maybe it won't be the case this year. Obviously, the benefit to the state would be huge in terms of the money coming in. We're already a state that doesn't collect a lot of tax revenue, compared to other states. So you could see that the windfall potentially coming from that.
Yeah, and I think some of that too is, what is the money going to be used for? How does this work? Especially we have casinos. Will that disincentivize people from going gambling? Like, there's a whole bunch of questions. And I think lawmakers said in 2023 that when this comes back in 2025, we'll take a second look at this. Like, we'll pass this now, and then we'll take a deeper dive and explore that. But there's definitely a lot of questions that need to be answered for sure.
As we start to wrap up here, and we really should have led with this because it affects so many Nevadans. You guys just had a conversation, I believe, recently about Medicaid cuts. The Trump administration and President Donald Trump himself has floated whether or not we should cut Medicaid to the tune of several $1 billion as they're trying to cut government spending. That would be a staggering impact on the state of Nevada. 300,000 Nevadans, the cost almost $2 billion, right? You've done a lot of reporting on this, Tabitha, and it's still kind of ever-changing right now. There's a hearing today, Wednesday, as we record, but a lot happening on the Medicaid front.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you need to understand that federal spending makes up about a third of our state budget. When we're talking about Medicaid, 60% comes from the federal government for your average Medicaid recipient. Now, there's also an expanded population that receives 90% federal funding to support them.
Wow. And
when you look at those rates, the proposal that folks are really talking about is a proposal to strip away that 90% coverage. And that estimated revenue loss of $1.9 billion, but the question then is, does the state pick up this population? And there's about more than 360,000 people who are on this because of the Medicaid expansion, 800,000 people in total on Medicaid. And lawmakers have said we cannot afford to cover that full population if the federal funding is not the same as it has been in the past.
And so those people would just be kicked off of their Medicaid plans.
That's the grand question, right? Now, a lot of these folks were added to the Medicaid rolls under the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, passed in 2010. They were added in 2014 under Medicaid expansion. Yeah. What I find really interesting is that it's the state's health care system that uses Medicaid dollars, right? It's hospitals and doctors' offices and nurses, going to see the nurse practitioner. That's who accepts Medicaid. So what's going to happen to the state's healthcare industry, which is floundering, right? Which really struggles to provide adequate healthcare for everyone in the state. What's going to happen when all of that money starts leaving the system?
Yeah. And especially for rural areas where, huge numbers and percentages of the population
Right.
are on Medicaid and using these rural hospitals that probably would not exist if not for federal, Medicaid.
And I think the other question that I have when it comes to this is we did a really thorough, in-depth series of about 4 stories looking at behavioral health care in Nevada, from everything from suicide to services for folks. And what we see is that a lot of the state's solutions to address the behavioral health crisis for youth in this state lie in federal matching dollars. If those go away, we're going to have to maybe go back to the drawing board and reassess what that looks like and potentially have a system where we have people that are still in limbo, unable to get services, especially in those rural communities.
Thank you guys for getting us up to speed on that. It's something that we're going to be tracking very closely, of course, because as we've talked about, potentially huge impact to Nevada. Now that we've gotten the heavier stuff out of the way, what's been the highlight of your session so far?
Oh, Tabitha, you got to go first.
Oh, I got to go first?
You gotta go first.
I'm still thinking.
Highlights.
I think that for me, stepping into the new role personally has been a big highlight, sort of stretching my knowledge, putting into place some new practices, revamping behind the bar a little bit, and then also finding ways to connect more with folks outside of the building to bring them into the legislative process and say, okay, how can we reach you, right? We wrote a participating in the legislative guide. I also think a highlight is I love the drive into Carson. I know that not a lot of people do, but it's beautiful.
Sure,
and it's nice to kind of see everyone in the building and have the camaraderie. Like I work from home typically, and so it's really nice to come in and work with other people and, see people like Paul and you and just having those connections are really vital.
Yeah, this is more of an office here in this building than you have
anywhere else.
Yeah. The drive into Carson, I will highlight, it is beautiful for sure because my producer, Kenzie, laughing in the background. She knows what I'm about to say here. You can look for the bald eagles this time of year along Washoe Lake. That has been a personal highlight of mine. So at least there's something to enjoy as you're making the trek to and from Carson. Every day in your guys' case.
What is up with bird watching right now? I just have to ask.
It's having a moment.
Doing it.
It's having a moment for sure.
I don't have time for bird watching.
I don't get it.
You don't need time. You're already driving to Carson. Just look at all they line the trees. This is.
I say I don't get bird watching, and yet I'm a gardener, so I'm literally going to my little greenhouse in my garage right now and looking at my seedlings and going like, yes, grow.
That's me. That's me. Do you see my pepper plants?
I did
see your pepper plants.
But I actually wintered mine for the first time. They're doing great.
We'll offline that conversation, but I do need to hear your tips and tricks.
But for me, I think that, of course, the camaraderie, seeing everybody, I've always enjoyed watching the governing process. I like watching and seeing lawmakers go through, make laws and how we actually govern ourselves and watch policy being developed. That is always really fun and interesting for me. And I'm glad I get to do it in a building where and with colleagues that are like you guys, fantastic. But for me, another personal thing that I'm excited about is that the Caucus Deli is open again.
Yes.
And that there is once again a little deli here in the building where you can actually go get something to eat in between all of the meetings, because
so if I have to leave these four walls.
Did you guys see some of the fun names though? My favorite was the Senate Caesar.
Yes.
And I was just like, we're stabbing Caesar salad. This is great.
So I'm glad that's open because it is nice to also just walk away and not talk to anybody for a few minutes and just grab something to drink and sit down.
Mm-hmm. It's been a highlight. Yeah, come down if you're an average, regular Nevadan, listen to this. Come down, advocate for a bill, but you can also get a nice lunch on the second floor that you couldn't get. And especially, too, coming out of COVID when it was really difficult for people to participate and to be here, all those restrictions, of course, are gone now. You can walk right in through the metal detectors, advocate for a bill, have a lunch, see some people you might have known or have known in the past, and it's lovely.
Absolutely.
If you're not on deadline.
And that's what it is. I think that it's part of it is just seeing the building be full of life again.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really nice to be here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a great place to end it. That's why I wanted to bring you guys on to get the expert insight and knowledge of two of the building's best reporters. We have spent probably hundreds of hours down in that press room together, and probably hundreds more over the next 195 days or so. Tabitha, Paul, thank you both for being here. We appreciate it. We'll let you get back to all the other great coverage inside the Carson City Legislative Building.
Thanks,
Thank
Ben.
you.
Again, a special thank you to Paul and Tabitha for joining me this episode, and Kenzie behind the scenes for making it all possible. Don't forget to follow them on social media, as well as my stations News 4 and Fox 11 for almost daily legislative coverage over the next 3 months. If you made it to the end of this episode, I really appreciate it. If you have guest ideas, episode ideas, questions, comments, compliments, concerns, anything at all, we want to hear from you. Shoot me an email at bjmargiott, Margiott, at sbgtv.com and put Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. If you have a minute, I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and a review. That helps the podcast show up higher in searches so more people can discover Ballot Battleground Nevada. Thanks for listening.